All right. So again, thank you very much for being here and thank you for the invitation. I'm here in the University of Pisa and I'm a geologist, a paleoclimatologist, and I'm saying this for saying that I'm not very used to talk about something that is connected to human, but at the same time, when I was studying some Holocenic samples from Sardinia in Italy, I found this study case very interesting. And this is the reason why I'm here with your wonderful community today. And what I'm gonna try to do today is to find the connection in between these elements that you can see here. So the cave deposits on the left, the most iconic are stalagmites, but also stalactites, and the culture, the civilization that was at some point during the Bronze and Iron Age in Sardinia, building, among others, these towers in Sardinia, which is the Italian island in the middle of the Western Mediterranean Sea, an island that during the Bronze Age was in intense connection with the overseas population for commerce, for exchange of ideas and knowledge, and at times for war. So I'm gonna have this content today. So I'm gonna give a brief introduction about cave deposits and also about the ancient Sardinian period. I'm gonna go through the study case and then we're gonna have together final remarks. So cave deposits. From a geological, paleoenvironmental perspective, caves are a good place to work because they can collect a huge quantity of material, sediments, or also chemical precipitated. And at time, the preservation is very high, at time higher than the surface. And this is useful for us so we can study the properties and connect these properties to what is going on at the surface. We can have the trial particles, like the one we can see on the left. But as I say, the most iconic cave deposits are the chemical precipitated that takes together the name of the speleothems. And at times, speleothems can build such a wonderful scenario. But for the matter of cave conservation, when we are studying speleothems, we usually collect only those samples that are already broken. So stalagmites that fall out because geological or other processes. So why speleothems form? They basically form because ACO3-rich water is dripping into the caves, forming the morphology that we have seen before. And at the same time, the rainfall is feeding the cave dripping. So basically, if we want to have some ingredients for the formation of stalagmites and speleothems in general, we need water, of course, that is given by rain. As I said before, we need usually a limestone or a dolostone bedrock that needs to be dissolved by the infiltrating water. Then we need the CO2 from the soil to allow this dissolution. And we have CO2 in soil because the activity of the vegetation. And of course, we need a cave that allows the dripping. And among these ingredients, we can see that the water and the CO2 are climate and environmental control. This is the reason why some properties of the speleothems can be connected with the climate at the outside the cave. And so during, of course, if speleothems form, it means that it's raining. And so this is the first paleoenvironmental indicator that about speleothems. But at the same time, during the percolation of the water from the surface to the cave, the water is dissolving, of course, the bedrock, and also is taking information from the soil layer, and so is bringing to the cave this information in form of geochemical properties of the speleothems, like stable isotopes of carbon and oxygen, but also in form of trace elements, and also at times in form of the shape and the stratigraphy and the micro and macro morphology of the speleothem itself. So in geological terms, speleothems are secondary chemical precipitated cave deposits, but in speleothem science, we can define them as paleoclimate records, paleoenvironmental indicators, and at times geological tools. Here on the left, you can see a speleothem that is sliced along its grow axis, and you can see these color bars that are the dating, because another good quality of speleothems that are composed by calcite is that they can be dated with the, for example, uranium-thorium method with high accuracy and precision. And so for a matter of paleoenvironmental and climate research, we can study the geochemical proxies like stable isotopes of carbon, oxygen, but also the trace elements, and I said before, and we're gonna construct an age model which is based on uranium and thorium dating method. And at the same time, we can study the stratigraphic, sedimentological, and morphological properties. The study area is Sardinia. As I said, is at the middle of the Western Mediterranean Sea. And at that time, it was a strategic location for all the people that were moving from the African continent, from the Levantine to the European continent, basically. And so it was the Bronze and the Iron Age was a great era for contact and exchanging not only products, but also ideas and knowledge. And regarding the Sardinia ancient period, it goes from 1750 more or less before Christ to more or less 500 years before Christ. This is the ancient Sardinian period. And in this period that encompasses the Bronze and the Iron Age, we have a phase which is called the Orientalizing, that is common around the Mediterranean. That means that there were strict, although peaceful contacts with people coming from the eastern part of the Mediterranean, like the Levantine. At the same time, suddenly the island was conquered around the 525 years before Christ by the Punics. So people coming from the modern Tunisia. And then later the Punics were defeated by the Romans that took over the control of more political control of the island. And so we can see here that these centuries and millennia across the Iron and Bronze Age, and then later was a period of intense contacts with overseas period. And this island hosts one of the most technological advanced civilization in the Mediterranean, and we can have an evidence about this for the huge cultural and architectonic heritage that these people left to us. And one of the most iconic symbols of this culture was the Nuragic Tower. In fact, the Nuragic civilization takes the name from these towers. Nuragic Tower that have different purposes. They were for defending, they were for housing and worshipping, but they are very widespread in the area. And this period is when actually the 6 centuries in between these towers, dry stone towers were built. But this ancient Sardinian period not only left Nuragic towers, which are on the left, we can see the still standing Nuragic tower that are more than 5,000 today. At the same time, around many of the single Nuragic towers, villages spread out. It means that the anthropic activity of some population was focused all around the main Nuragic towers. And we can consider the Nuragic villages that we have more or less 300 today as a kind of proto-cities. The first more intense anthropic activity developed all around the main Nuragic towers. And for example, this is how today can look like one single Nuragic village when we have the main Nuragic tower in the middle and all the shelters and the houses all around. I was saying before that this period not only left towers, but only have all other artifacts like tombs carved in the bedrock, for example. Here on the top we see a nuraga and then the tombs in the on the bottom carved in the bedrock. But also sites that were for worshipping, for example, the cult of water. This is the Santa Cristina sacred pit. But also left art in the form of bronze statues. These are collected in the Archaeological National Museum in Cagliari. And also left something which is called dolmen or menhir. And so these are all examples that say the technological advance of these civilizations around the Mediterranean. However, a complete understanding of the relation between the ancient Sardinian period civilization and the climate and environment is still lacking. This is the reason why at some point I try to start to explore this period by studying speleothems from caves that are as much close to important Nuragic village. It is because my first expertise is in fact to study speleothems. And for this reason, I targeted this area of Sardinia. We are in the central eastern portion of the island, which is a karst terrain, a limestone and dolostone karst terrain in a place that is called Supramonte and Golfo di Orosei National Park. In this part of the highlands, as we can see here, we have many Nuragic village. And I spotted this village on the top picture, which is called the Ormurales Nuragic village, which is counting today more or less 100 shelters. We are in the municipality of Urzulei. And very close to this village, there is the Subterra de Sarpis cave. We're gonna call this cave Sarpis hereafter. These two elements are very close. In the top right picture, we can see the location of Sarpis cave in the geological map, which is more or less 1 kilometer apart to the Ormulares Nuragic village. And from the section, we can see that there is only a small creek, which is called Curcuri Creek, which is dividing the original village to the cave, and more or less the surface above the cave is gently dipping or almost flat. From this other picture, we can appreciate how the cave and the village are very close. From this image from Google Earth, we can see that are around 1 kilometer apart. And so from this cave, we collected these 5 speleothems, these 5 stalagmites. And all of them, the thing is, we only sampled 5 stalagmites, and all of them were reporting this peculiar stratigraphy. It means that there is a neat and very clear discontinuity, at times shifting from brownish to yellowish color, and at time, like in the SARP 5 sample, shifting from a silver color like fabric to a whitish like fabric. But according to my experience, I was very surprised because it's not so common that each single speleothem collected in a single cave contains such a clear, very similar discontinuity. So I was very curious about that. And because also discontinuity in speleothems have a very strict meaning. It means that there is a major shift in genetic condition, of course, and this is because the macro discontinuities in speleothems are potential indicators for climate and environmental change occurring at the surface. Every time that we have a disturbance into the hydrological circulation, it is possible that there are discontinuities in speleothems, at times connected with hiatus, so a depositional gap, or at times we can even have a discontinuity without having a chronological hiatus. So this is the analysis that I accomplished into the speleothems. And the first thing I did, and I was curious about, is about the age of the samples. This is because the first thing I did is to accomplish some dating. And we can see that each of the 5 samples has a date on the bottom, on the top, and then just above and below the main discontinuity. And this is for constrain the entire period of the growth of the speleothems, and at the same time to try to constrain, chronologically constrain the age of this discontinuity itself. So this is done for each of the sample. At the same time, I'm here visualizing the shift in macro morphology, in macro fabric by using this colored bar. So the brownish from the bottom part and the whitish from the upper part. And at the same time, I accomplished a stable isotopic analysis, a trace elements analysis, and then also I took a look to the micro and macro fabric of this sample. At the same time, I needed a method to better constrain the chronology, as I said before, and because discontinuities can be or cannot be associated to a hiatus, and at the same time, the uncertainties of the ages were at times very large, I had to integrate 2 approaches for constructing the age model when I put a hiatus in the model, and at times I didn't put the hiatus. So to better constrain, as I said, the chronology of the discontinuity. But this is possibly too bit into detail. The most important thing that I came out with this stratigraphic approach based on the uranium thorium model, and we can see by the change of color in these samples, and on the left the age axis here expressed in kilo years, so thousands of years before present, that we can start with consideration about the age of the discontinuity. For example, in these 4 samples, the discontinuity certainly took place in between 2.7 and 1.7 kilo years ago. And hiatuses could be associated with the discontinuity in sample 2, 3, and 4 with a different length of the hiatus of 1,000 to 300 years. At the same time, here with the star, the discontinuity is better constrained in SARP1 at 2.1 kilo years before present, and in SARP2 in between 2.4 and 2.1 kilo year before present. Instead, the SARP5 speleothems is the only one which is reporting an evident hiatus, is a multimillennial hiatus that goes from 5 kilo years to 1.8 kilo years before present. So this is the stratigraphic framework of the stalagmites I proposed before. And if we put together this information with the historical events that I presented before, we can really see that something is going on at around the age of the discontinuity. For example, the first discontinuity can be correlating with the orientalizing phase that, as I said, is that phase in which there were deep contacts with people coming from the Levantine, and contacts were so deep that the architecture and the art and the funerary costumes were changing at that time. At the same time, the other discontinuity can be related, like here, can be related with the invasion of Punics first and later to the Roman times. But is this really connected with something culturally changing that was going on at the surface, or we can also suppose that is related to the climate? In order to respond to this question, we have to take a look to the results of the analysis, as I mentioned before. These are microphotographs for the carbonated fabrics. We have each samples have 3 pictures shift in the fabric, and on the bottom part there are fabric that are called more columnar-like fabric, while in the top part there are fabrics that are more elongated, columnar elongator, at times acicular, like fabric. We're gonna talk about this fabric later. But at the same time, there are also changing in the macromorphology of the samples. For example, in the bottom part, we can see that the shape and the morphology of the speleothems is what is called more globular, so is more regular as a shape, while in the top part of the speleothems, if we go above the main discontinuity, we have different shape, an accretional pattern which is called progradational, and at time the stacking like pattern of the lamina of the speleothems are rimmed and at time flat. And this is all to say that together the micro and macro fabric indicate a shift from regular to constant drip rate and supersaturation with respect carbonate below the main discontinuity to a non-regular and at time discontinuous drip rate and supersaturation with respect the carbonate species above the main discontinuity. So there is actually a change in the genetic condition of these samples, and the fabric above the discontinuity is indicating that the karst aquifer was recharged by more seasonal and flushes like recharge, rather than a more regular recharge. At the same time, we can have a look to the results of the stable isotopes. In this case, I'm presenting box and whiskers graph, which have with the brown bars the bottom part of the samples, with a whitish bar the top part of the sample, and the white bar is actually the whole samples. Just to say that there is a clear a time shift in between the stable isotope of oxygen shifting to more EV isotopes, and while for the carbon is not so neat this difference, and at time the composition, isotopic composition for the carbon is quite constant. And there is a interesting fact here, because as I said, the delta Ho18 is mostly enriched from below to above the discontinuity, and this could be connected to aridity or water evaporation into soils. At the same time, the carbon is mostly at time depleted or constant from above the discontinuity to below. And this will mean that vegetation bioproductivity is increasing. But aridity and water evaporation in one side and increased vegetation bioproductivity from the other side is very difficult to explain by climate only. I actually try to connect if these discontinuities were connected with the main climate reconstruction that were done by Regatieri et al. In 2014 for the Western Mediterranean Sea. So we can see the wetter condition on the right and the left, drier condition on the left. This study was accomplished in the Corchia cave in Italy mainland. But at the same time, it's very difficult to connect a single climate event, for example, those dry spells occurring at 3.1, 2.8, or even 4.2 kilo years before present, to asynchronous discontinuities in these speleothems. And I would expect if the main cause for the discontinuity was a climate event, for example, aridification, I would expect that all of them were synchronous in the speleothems. But this is not the case. At the same time, I try to put all along the axis the stable isotopes for the 5 samples, but this is not a very good job because the age model is not very good, and at the same time, the discontinuity are asynchronous, as I said. But what I can see from this graph is that all around the main discontinuity, which is marked with a gray vertical bar here in this graph, there is not a constant pattern of carbon and oxygen stable isotopes. So again, it's very difficult to explain this isotopic behavior by climate only. So we can have a look to the anthropic activity. Why not? That in some ways was possibly and potentially modifying the environment at the surface, and so impacting in the hydrological circulation, and then finally in the speleothems. And this is interesting to note the results for the trace elements. In this case, I'm presenting phosphorus and zincum only in the very discrete portion of the speleothems just across the discontinuity. So 15 millimeters below and above the discontinuity. And because phosphorus first and zincum secondary are related to colloids, so organic proper particles that are taken from the soil, and phosphorus is also an indication of agricultural activity at times, and also animal circulation and farming above the cave. We can see that there is a neat increase across the discontinuity of phosphorus, for example. That gives me the first indication that something could be connected with anthropic activity at the surface. At the same time, and this is a bit complicated to present this image, I made a trace elements intercorrelation in between all the elements I have analyzed. You can see in the vertical and horizontal axis. There is the gray diagonal line that symbolize the discontinuity. And so below this gray line, which is numbered from 1 to 5 according to the number of the speleothems, below this gray line, there are the intercorrelation of elements below the main discontinuity, while above there is the intercorrelation above the main discontinuity. And we can see that with the green box, there is indicated the significant positive correlation in between these elements. You have to cross the vertical and horizontal line, and there is a neat increase in the intercorrelation in between elements. This suggests to me that above the discontinuity, something is controlling the geochemistry of the speleothems differently from what it was going on below. And so the phosphorus, as I said, indicates a major contribution by soil in form of colloids, and at the same time, the intercorrelation of soil-related and particle-related elements above the main discontinuity, in this case, point to a major control of pedogenic layers into the stalagmite geochemistry rather than hydrogeological factors only. So here the changes are occurring in my opinion, at the soil level. And so, but what could be causing this changing that is also not as synchronous events, but have to be something that is widespread through time and space? As I said, this was a period with deep changes in the cultural and also activities of the Sardinian population, and we have evidences that the contacts with the Eastern population, and then after the invasion of the Punics and Romans, there was an increase in something like the deforesting for obtaining timber and clearance for agriculture and farming. For example, for paleological studies, there is an increase on holm oaks that were, replaced with cork oaks. And also we have evidences of new crops like the grapevine and the melon. And so it is possible that even in that area with this intense cultural changing, there was an increase in agriculture and farming. And so this new practice way possibly introduced and pushed by the exchange with overseas population. But how this impact of deforesting, for example, could impact the samples that we have seen? We have, if we have deforesting, we have indeed a disturbance in the hydrological cycle, because the penetration of the water underground is different, is impacted, and so we can have a speleothem discontinuity in this case. We have a more seasonal recharge because we don't have the attrition of the trees, basically, from the rainfall that is falling into the ground. And so this irregular dripping could make the fabric change that we have seen before. Also, if we have deforestation, we have an increase in delta O18 because isotopes become more heavy, basically. At the same time, we still have a vegetation activity if we have farming, because people want that their crops are productive. And so we have possibly, even with the biological fertilization, that the biological activity is high. At the same time, if we have a reworking, a cyclical reworking of the soil, because of the people that are working there for the agriculture activity, we have an increase of phosphorus and, of course, this for the soil related elements, and so the correlation that we have seen before. And so basically we are going to an end of this talk. With this very preliminary study, I think that a cultural change that was absorbed in a various millennia in Sardinia could change the stratigraphic and geochemical properties that we have seen in the speleothems, and possibly this cultural shift were fostering deforestation, and so new land use and practice that were impacting on the speleothems. And from this actually not very good drawing, we can see that from the left to the right there is gradual deforestation with the increase of clearance, and so the agriculture and farming activity, which is possibly impacting on the geochemistry of the speleothems and also to the stratigraphical properties of the samples themselves. I think I've finished here. I want to just give you a take-home message that can be that speleothems can be a tool to detect impacts on land use due to cultural shift, and there is, I think, potential for other human traces investigation. If you have any idea, I'm very happy to talk about them with you. And with this, I want to thank you, all of you in the audience, and also all my all the co-authors and collaborators of these studies, and you can read the names